There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a mountain town when something has gone wrong and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Wyatt Hargrove had ridden through enough towns in his 35 years to know the difference between ordinary
The
quiet
law is the law,
and the
Mrs.
quiet of
Dutton.
people
This
holding their
land is
breath.
property of the Livestock
Coldwater
Association.
Station
only
wore
law
that
that
second
matters
kind
out
of
here is
silence,
me.
like a
Get off
coat
my
pulled
land.
tight against the coming winter, and he felt it 2 miles out before he ever crossed the threshold of the place. It was his horse that told him first. The animal had been with him for 7 years through the high passes of the Bitterroot Range and the open stretches of Wyoming and the long cold silences of Montana in February when the world reduced itself to wind and white and the sound of hooves on frozen ground. In 7 years, Wyatt had learned to read that horse the way other men read almanacs. He knew the particular way the ears came forward when something worth investigating lay around a bend. He knew the shortened stride that meant uncertain footing, and he knew the slow, deliberate pulling back that meant something else entirely, something the horse had smelled before, something it had no urgency to approach. The animal began that slow pulling back when Coldwater Station was still just a collection of rooftops and chimney smoke visible through the ponderosa pines. Wyatt felt the change in the shoulders first, that subtle drop in forward momentum, and he did not spur the horse on. He sat with it for a moment, his hands loose on the reins, his eyes moving over what he could see of the town ahead. He had been here once before 3 years ago, briefly passing through on his way north. He remembered the general store, the livery, the single street of storefronts that constituted the whole of civic life in this particular corner of Montana territory. He remembered James Whitfield pointing out the landmarks with the quiet pride of a man who had watched a place grow from nothing and considered himself part of that growth. James Whitfield. That was why Wyatt was here, now riding toward a town that smelled wrong, according to a horse he trusted more than most men. James had written 3 weeks ago a letter that had caught up with Wyatt in Missoula after traveling through 2 forwarding addresses and the uncertain goodwill of several postmasters. The letter was practical in the way James was always practical, short on sentiment and long on specifics. There were some matters on the ranch that needed attention. There was a fence line on the eastern boundary that required evaluation. There was a question about water rights documentation that James wanted a second pair of eyes on, someone he could trust to read a situation clearly. He had written Wyatt's name at the top of the page and underlined it once, which was as close to urgency as James Whitfield ever came in correspondence. Wyatt had ridden south and then west, taking the better part of 2 weeks to cross the distance, slowed by an early snowfall in the passes, and one lame afternoon when his horse threw a shoe on loose shale outside of a town too small to have a proper blacksmith. He had told himself somewhere in that journey that he was not late, that James had not specified urgency, that the letter was dated, yes, but letters always aged in transit, and that was simply the nature of correspondence across mountain distances. He had told himself that. He had believed it more or less right up until the moment his horse began to pull back 2 miles outside of Coldwater Station on a September morning, with the aspen trees gone gold all through the hills, and the air carrying the first real promise of the cold that was coming. He did not spur the horse. He let it find its own pace. And he rode into town at a walk that felt, in the particular quiet of that morning, like arriving at the wrong end of something. His brothers rode in behind him as they always did, not because Wyatt was the oldest, though he was, or because he had given any signal, though he had not. They rode behind him because in the years since they had been on their own, since the 3 of them had learned to navigate the world without anyone to fall back on, except each other, some unspoken arrangement had organized itself around Wyatt naturally, the way water organizes itself around a stone in a river, flowing according to the shape of things rather than any deliberate plan. Everett Hargrove was 31 4 years behind Wyatt and 3 years ahead of Reed, and he occupied the middle position in more ways than the purely numerical. He was the one who talked to strangers first, who found the angle into a conversation that made people comfortable enough to say what they actually meant rather than what they thought you wanted to hear. He had learned this not from any formal education, which none of the 3 brothers had received in any consistent way, but from years of trading and negotiating and reading the particular language of human faces when they were trying to hide something. Everett Hargrove could tell you within 30 seconds of meeting a person whether they were honest and within 2 minutes whether they were dangerous. He was rarely wrong on either count. Reed was 28, the youngest, and he moved through the world with the compressed energy of a man who thought and acted in very nearly the same instant. Where Wyatt was still and Everett was fluid, Reed was contained force like water behind a dam, always present, always exerting pressure, rarely still. He had not learned quiet in the way his oldest brother had learned it. What he had learned was when quiet mattered more than speaking, which was not quite the same thing, but served most of the same purposes. The three of them rode down the single main street of Coldwater Station, and the town looked at them the way small towns look at men who arrive together when none of them is smiling. Shop fronts registered them. A man loading a wagon paused with a crate half raised and watched them pass. A woman sweeping the steps of a boarding house pulled her broom in close as though creating a kind of invisible boundary. Wyatt took all of this in without expression. He had been looked at like this before in a dozen towns, and the looking itself was not information. What was information was the particular quality of the looking, and what he read in Coldwater Station that morning was not hostility or curiosity, but something more complicated, something that knew something it was not sure it wanted to share. The old stagecoach driver was the one who said it, leaning against the post outside the relay station, with the air of a man who had been sitting with hard news long enough that the weight of it had outgrown his patience with silence. He was old enough that his face had arranged itself into a permanent expression of weathered regret, and he looked at Wyatt directly in a way that nobody else on that street was managing. He pulled the brim of his hat down, once a gesture that might have been a greeting, or might have been something else. And then he said it plainly, the way plain men say plain things when there is no better option available. James Whitfield had been dead for 2 weeks, a fall from his horse near the eastern fence line. His head had struck a rock. The sheriff had closed the file in 4 days. Wyatt heard this without moving. He sat on his horse in the middle of the street while the town of Coldwater Station went about its quiet business around him, and he absorbed the information the way a man absorbs a blow that he has half expected but hoped would not come. Everett on his left looked at him, not at the old stagecoach driver, not at the street, but at Wyatt reading the thing in his brother's face that most people would not have known to look for and would not have found even if they had known. Everett found it. He said nothing. Reed on his right, was it an accident? The old man pulled at his hat again. He looked at the street to his left and to his right before he answered a small, involuntary survey that told Wyatt more about the state of Coldwater Station in that moment than anything the man might say. People are calling it that, the old man said. Wyatt looked at him steadily. What do you call it? The old man held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment, Wyatt could see the arithmetic being done, the weighing of what could be said against what had to be lived with afterward. Then the old man stepped back inside the relay station and let the door close behind him, and that too was an answer of a kind. They had been standing outside the sheriff's office for 10 minutes working through the practical question of what came next when Everett spoke first. The woman, he said. Wyatt followed his brother's eyes across the street. She was standing in front of the general store, and the situation she was in was the kind that resolved itself into a clear picture within seconds if you knew how to look at people. She was young, early 20s at most, with honey-colored hair, pinned partially up and coming loose in soft pieces around her face, after what appeared to be a very long journey. Her dress was navy blue, good quality, fitted properly once, and now carrying the particular exhaustion of clothes that had been worn for too many consecutive days on too many consecutive miles of bad road. There was a small cameo brooch at her throat and a traveling bag near her feet, and the posture of someone who had been doing an extremely good job of appearing calm for an extremely long time. The man behind the store counter, a heavy-set man with a merchant's careful eyes, was refusing her something. The nature of the refusal was not yet clear from a distance, but the nature of the two men standing near the store entrance was clear enough. They were dressed in the manner of men from somewhere with better tailors in Montana Territory, their boots too clean for this kind of country, their guns worn high on the hip in the particular way of men who carry them as accessories rather than tools. They were watching the woman in the way that Wyatt had seen men watch people they intended to make problems for. He was across the street before he had thought about crossing it. He came to stand beside her rather than in front of her, which was a different choice than most men would have made and one he made without deliberating over it. He stood to her left and slightly forward, his shoulders at their natural width, which was considerable, and he looked at the two men near the entrance with the expression he used when he needed to communicate a great deal of information in a very short period of time without saying anything at all. The expression was not angry. It was not threatening in any conventional way. It was simply the expression of a man who had been doing difficult and occasionally violent things for 20 years in hard country and had arrived at a kind of complete internal stillness about it, the way water in a very deep place is still, even when everything above it is moving. The two men looked at him and performed their own rapid calculations and came up with the same answer. They left. The woman turned and looked at him. She was perhaps an inch above 5 feet in height, which meant the top of her head came to the approximate level of his collarbone. But the way she looked at him had nothing small about it. She assessed him in 3 seconds with eyes that were a clear, direct blue and contained within them something that Wyatt recognized from the mirror and from the faces of people who had survived things. The particular intelligence that comes from learning early that the world does not automatically arrange itself in your favor, and that you are responsible for your own navigation of it. You came because of James Whitfield, she said. It was not a question. I came because he asked me to help with some things on the ranch, Wyatt said. He is dead. I know, I was told just now. She looked at him for another second, completing whatever assessment she was running. Then she said, My name is Eliza Harper. I am the woman he was going to marry. I need help of the kind that the law in this town will not provide. She paused. Buy me a cup of coffee, and I will tell you everything. Behind Wyatt, he heard Everett make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a word. The sound a man makes when something lands exactly as he expected it to land. He did not turn around to look at his brother. All right, he said. The coffee house was 2 doors down from the general store, a narrow room with 4 tables and a counter and a stove in the back that produced coffee, hot enough to be worth the price. Wyatt took the corner table out of habit, positioning himself with his back to the wall in a clear line of sight to the door, and the others arranged themselves around him as they always did. Eliza Harper sat across from him and folded her hands on the table in front of her and began to talk. She talked the way someone talks when they have been rehearsing a conversation in their head for a long time and are determined not to waste the opportunity by being imprecise. She did not begin with her feelings about the situation. She began with the facts ordered clearly, one following another, like properly stacked fence rails. Her name was Eliza Harper. She was 22 years old and had been raised in Boston, Massachusetts, where she had worked for the past 3 years as a governess and tutor to children of several families in the better neighborhoods near the waterfront. Her father had died when she was 16. Her mother had died 14 months ago after a slow illness that had used up what remained of the small savings they had kept. She was not destitute, she said, but she was not far from it, and she was intelligent enough to see the direction things were traveling in. 6 months ago, she had answered an advertisement in a Boston newspaper. A rancher in Montana Territory, James Whitfield, age 47, widower, owner, and operator of a working cattle ranch 12 miles north of Coldwater Station. The advertisement had been direct in the way that honest advertisements usually are, asking for a woman of good character and practical intelligence, making no promises of romance and no apologies for the absence of such promises. He needed a partner, he had written, someone who could manage a household and keep accounts and contribute to the running of a serious enterprise. He offered a home of fair standing in the community and the respect owed to a partner in that kind of life. She had written back, He had written in return. Over 6 months, they had exchanged 14 letters, and she had developed from those letters a portrait of a man who was honest, somewhat solitary, deeply attached to the land he had built, and entirely serious about what he was proposing. He did not love her. He had been clear about that, but he respected the intelligence evident in her letters he had said, and respect was something he could guarantee, which was more than most men promising love could actually deliver. She had agreed. She had settled her few affairs in Boston, sold what could be sold, said goodbye to what could not be transported, and boarded a series of conveyances that had carried her across the width of the country over 18 days to a town in Montana where the man she had traveled to meet had been dead for 2 weeks. She said all of this without her voice breaking. Wyatt noted this. He noted the way her hands remained folded and on the table, the knuckles occasionally whitening, and then releasing the only visible evidence of what it cost her to remain as composed as she appeared. She had been in Coldwater Station for 2 days, she continued. In those 2 days, she had visited the sheriff's office where a man named Earl Boone had informed her that she had no legal claim on anything related to James Whitfield, that a mail order arrangement not yet completed by legal marriage carried no weight under territorial law, and that she should arrange transportation east as soon as possible. He had said all of this while wearing a pocket watch that she described as new gold, the kind of watch that cost what a small-town sheriff in rural Montana territory would need 6 months of salary to afford. She had noted the watch. She had not said anything about it. She had thanked the sheriff and left. In 2 days, she had also observed three other things. The first was that three of the ranches visible from the main road north out of town were empty, their buildings still standing, but their fields unworked and their livestock gone, and their small for sale notices bearing the same company name. The second was that the two men she had just encountered outside the general store had been visible near the Whitfield Ranch property the previous afternoon, standing at a distance on a small rise and looking toward the buildings below them. The third was that those same two men had been following her loosely but consistently for most of her first day in Coldwater Station. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the stove. Wyatt had not touched his coffee. He became aware of this fact now and picked it up and drank from it, and it was exactly hot enough and exactly strong enough, which was one small thing going correctly on an otherwise troubled morning. He had been watching her hands while she talked. He had done this for the same reason a person watches water when they want to understand a river. The surface tells you one story and the movement underneath tells you another, and the second story is usually the more accurate one. Her hands had told him that she was frightened and had been frightened for a long time, long enough that she had learned to build something steady over the top of it, the way you build a bridge over water that will not stop moving. He had seen that particular construction before in people who had carried hard things alone when they had no other choice. He believed her, not because her story was persuasive, though it was, because he recognized what she was hiding beneath the composure, and people who had to try that hard to stay level were almost always telling the truth. "We should look at the property," he said. Something shifted in her face, very small, the kind of shift that follows a release of a very small amount of tension from a load that has been carried a very long time. When she said, "This afternoon," Everett, who had been sitting with the particular attentiveness he used when he was reading a situation and finding it more complex than it first appeared, looked at Wyatt and then at Eliza, and then back at his coffee without comment. Reed was looking out the window at the street, but his ears were up. Wyatt knew his brother's ears were up the same way he knew when the horse was paying attention to something beyond what the eyes could see. Reed had not looked at the woman across the table once during the entire conversation, but he had heard every word. They drank their coffee. Then they rode north. The 12 miles north of Coldwater Station told a story that the town itself had only partially told. The land was good, genuinely good, the kind of land that people who know land recognize immediately, not by beauty, but by the quality of the grass and the persistence of the water, and the way the soil held its color even in September when everything else was beginning to go dry. A creek ran parallel to the road for most of the distance, water moving clear and steady over a bed of smooth stone, the sound of it constant and clean in the dry mountain air. This was what James Whitfield had built his life around. Wyatt understood this as they rode, the understanding coming not from memory or from what Eliza had told him, but from the land itself, which was speaking in the language that land speaks to people who have spent enough years listening to it. This was water country, not rich water, not eastern water, not the kind of abundance that people who had never been thirsty took for granted. This was the kind of water that in a dry year meant the difference between a herd that survived and a herd that did not, between a community that held together and a community that scattered. Whoever owned this creek owned something that went beyond the fence lines of one ranch. They passed 3 empty properties on the way. Wyatt studied each one as they rode past. The houses were still standing and the fences were still up and the windmills were still turning in the light September wind, but there was an absence to these places that had nothing to do with the physical structures. People had been here. People had made decisions about whether to stay or go, and the decisions had all gone the same direction, and whatever had pushed those decisions had pushed them hard enough that nobody had stayed to argue. The Whitfield Ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, set back from the creek on a slight rise that gave it good drainage and a clearer view of the approaches from all 4 directions. The house was 2 stories timber framed with a wide porch facing south and windows placed thoughtfully for light and air. The barn was large and well-built, the kind of barn that a man builds when he intends to be somewhere for a very long time and wants the structure to outlast him. The south pasture held cattle, a respectable herd, by any measure moving in the unhurried way of animals that have been well managed and have no reason to be anxious. It was the property of a man who had known what he was building and had built it carefully. Wyatt looked at it and felt the particular weight that comes with understanding what has been lost. He also noticed within the first 30 seconds of arrival 3 things that had nothing to do with the qualities of the ranch itself. The first was the track marks near the barn. The soil in the yard was still damp from rain 2 days prior, which made it excellent for holding impressions, and the impressions it was holding were multiple and recent. Several horses had stopped near the barn entrance. They had stood for a period and then departed, the toe marks of departure deeper than the heel marks of approach, indicating urgency. This had happened within the last 48 hours, possibly less. The second was the latch on the equipment shed, which had been refastened incorrectly. Not carelessly, but incorrectly, in the specific way that a person who is not familiar with the particular mechanism of that latch would refasten it after opening and closing it. The third was the eastern fence line. Wyatt rode to it while Everett stayed with Eliza in the yard, and Reed dismounted to read the ground near the barn. The eastern fence line was where James had supposedly died, where his horse had supposedly thrown him against a rock. Wyatt studied the ground around the section of fence that the sheriff's report had indicated. He studied it for 4 minutes without speaking or moving. Then he stood up and looked at the fence itself, and then at the approach from the road, and then at the distance from the nearest rock formation. There were no impressions in the soil consistent with a panicked horse. A horse that throws a rider does not leave the orderly, evenly spaced prints that were visible here. A horse in genuine fear leaves a different record, the ground churned and the stride pattern broken, and the evidence of a body that was doing something involuntary and therefore violent. What the ground near this fence section showed was orderly, considered. The marks of animals that had been moved, not panicked. Reed appeared at his shoulder. He had come up without sound, as Reed often did, moving the way he moved when he was in the mountains, and did not want to disturb what he was reading. "Somebody has been here," Reed said. "Not once." "No," Wyatt agreed, "not once." They were looking at things. They were measuring. They stood together for a moment in the particular quiet of 2 men who have arrived at the same conclusion by different routes and do not need to say anything further about it. Then they walked back to the yard where Everett and Eliza were waiting. Inside the house, James Whitfield's presence was everywhere in the way that a careful man's presence always is. His books on the shelf beside the fireplace were arranged by subject, not by size. His account ledgers on the desk in the small room he had used as an office were dated and labeled on the spine. His tools were hung on their designated hooks in the mudroom, and the outlines of each tool were painted on the board behind them so that it was immediately apparent when something was missing. This was the house of a man who thought about systems and trusted them. Eliza moved through it with a restraint that Wyatt noticed. She was touching things carefully when she touched anything at all, in the way of a person entering a space that belongs to someone they have known only through letters and are now encountering as a physical presence for the first time. There was a quality to her movements in that house that Wyatt found himself recognizing without being able to name it immediately. Then he named it grief. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that comes when you mourn something you never quite had, which in some ways is the hardest kind because there is no clear event to attach it to. She found the letter in the late afternoon. She had been going through the papers in James's office, working methodically from left to right across the desk when she paused and reached for the corner of the rug that lay beneath the desk chair. She had noticed some irregularity in the floor's surface under the rug's edge, and she moved the rug to reveal a section of flooring where one board lay slightly higher than its neighbors, and the finish was worn in the exact pattern that a fingernail would wear it if someone had been lifting that board regularly for a period of years. She lifted the board. She reached into the space below. She withdrew a sealed envelope. She stood up and looked at it, and then looked across the room to where Wyatt was standing in the doorway. The envelope was addressed in James Whitfield's handwriting. It said, Wyatt Hargrove, if you are reading this, I am dead, and it was not an accident. Nobody in the room said anything. So Wyatt came forward and took the envelope. He opened it. He read what was inside with the stillness of a man who has long since learned that bad news does not become better or worse based on the expression with which you receive it. He read the letter through twice. Then he folded it along its original creases and set it on the desk in front of Eliza. He set it in front of her and not to the side, a deliberate placement that said, you are part of this. You have the right to know. James had written the letter 6 weeks before his death. He had begun to notice things approximately 8 weeks before that, a period of 10 weeks in total during which he had assembled quietly and carefully and alone a picture of what was being arranged around him. The railroad was coming north. Not as rumor, but as engineering fact, a planned extension of the territorial line that would run from the eastern edge of Montana Territory in a long diagonal northwest toward the mountains and the passes that led eventually to the Pacific coast. A railroad in this terrain needed water at regular intervals, not for passengers, but for the engines that pulled them, and the intervals of this particular line happened to place one of those requirements squarely in the Coldwater Creek watershed. Not in the creek itself, but in what the creek represented. The water rights to Coldwater Creek, the documentation James had held since 1863, gave the holder authority over the primary water source for the entire Northern Valley. Every ranch in the Northern Range depended on this water during dry years. The railroad needed a water station, and a water station required guaranteed access to a reliable source, and the reliable source was Coldwater Creek. And Coldwater Creek ran through the Whitfield Ranch and was legally controlled by the documents James had signed 25 years ago. The entity pursuing this was a land company registered in the city of Chicago, operating in Montana Territory through an agent named Victor Danton. 3 ranches in the Northern Range had already sold. All 3 had sold to the same company at prices that James had calculated based on his knowledge of the land values in the area to be 40 to 60% below fair market value. The timing of the sales, the identity of the buyer, and the amounts paid all told the same story when you knew how to read them. Danton's representative on the ground was a man named Shaw, 43 years old, with a background that James had only been able to sketch in outline, former military professional, in the way that certain men become professional about things that most men would not want to professionalize. Shaw had been in Coldwater Station for 6 months. He had arrived at approximately the same time that the problems for the neighboring ranches had begun. James had also written about Eliza Harper. He had written about her with the plain language of a man who did not trade in sentiment, but knew when something mattered. He had arranged for her to come, he wrote, not only because he needed a partner in the ordinary sense of the word, but because he had understood in the months since he began watching what was being assembled around him, that a partner with legal standing in the property would complicate the acquisition in ways that would take time to untangle. Under territorial law, a completed mail order arrangement conveyed inheritance rights. He had been specific about this. He had also written something else, something that Wyatt read twice and then a third time. He had written that he trusted Wyatt Hargrove with the letter and with the situation because in 20 years of knowing men in hard country, he had found very few who would stay when staying was difficult. He had written that he believed Wyatt was one of those few. He had written, "Protect the water. This is a responsibility to the whole valley, not a matter of one man's property." He had written those words, and then 6 weeks later, he had died in a fall from a horse that, according to the evidence of the ground, had never panicked at all. Reed was the first one to speak after Wyatt finished reading aloud the parts they needed to hear. He said what he thought directly because that was how Reed said things. "This is not our business. James is gone. We came because he asked, and he is no longer here to ask." Everett looked at the envelope, and then at the letter, and then at the window. "He put our names on it, Reed, not someone else's, ours. James is dead. He cannot be held responsible for what we choose. He trusted us with it, knowing he might not be there to see what we did with the trust. That is not nothing." Wyatt had moved to the window while his brothers talked. He stood there looking at the south pasture where James's cattle were moving in the late afternoon light, the herd slow and easy and completely unaware that anything had changed. The light on the grass was the specific gold of September afternoons in mountain country, the kind of light that lasts only a few weeks before the angle of the sun changes and something cooler takes its place. He thought about the winter 3 years ago, the Bitterroot Range in February, and the snowfield that had moved without warning on a clear afternoon, and the 3 minutes of cold and dark and absolute disorientation that had followed, and the rope that had found his wrist in that darkness, and the voice calling from somewhere above and to the left of him, steady and methodical, the voice of a man who had not panicked and was not going to panic because panic in that situation helped no one. And James Whitfield had understood that completely. He turned from the window. "James pulled me out of a slide on the Bitterroot 3 years ago. I am alive because of that. This is not something I can leave undone." Reed looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter on the table, and then at Eliza Harper, sitting quietly across from them, and then back at Wyatt. He did not agree out loud. He did not need to. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who has made his objection clearly and understood that the decision has been made by the person whose decision it was to make. That evening, the four of them ate at the kitchen table with the food that Eliza had made from what she had found in James's pantry, which was better stocked than she might have expected, and spoke well of the man's practical habits. She cooked without fuss and without asking for help or direction, and what she produced was simple and hot and exactly what the situation called for, which was not sophistication but sustenance. Everett ate with the attentiveness of a man who was thinking about several things at once and found the eating useful as something to do with his hands while he thought them through. Reed ate without comment and then served himself a second portion from the pot on the stove without asking which was his version of a compliment, as Wyatt knew from years of observation. When the meal was finished, Wyatt spoke. He said that he would go to Coldwater Station the next day and gather what information could be gathered about Danton and Shaw and the situation generally. He said that Everett should spend the day examining the full perimeter of the property, the water access points in particular, and map what he found. He said that Reed would know what Reed needed to do, which Reed acknowledged with a nod. Then he looked at Eliza Harper and said that she should spend the day going through James's papers. All of them, every document, every ledger, every piece of correspondence she could find. He said it because she was clearly capable of it and because none of the three of them had the education that such work required, and he said it without qualifying it or apologizing for asking it, simply as a statement of what needed to be done and by whom it could best be done. She looked at him with the same assessment she had brought to bear in the coffee house that morning, the 3-second evaluation that she seemed to apply to everything before she accepted it or responded to it. Then she nodded once. Outside the creek ran on in the darkness, cold and clear and constant, as it had run for every night of the 15 years James Whitfield had spent building something on these 12 miles of good Montana land. The first 3 days on the Whitfield Ranch established themselves according to a rhythm that nobody designed and nobody announced, the way rhythms in working places always establish themselves, organized by necessity rather than preference, and accepted by people who understand that the work does not pause while you are deciding how you feel about it. Wyatt was usually gone before full light. He moved through the ranch in the early hours the way he moved through mountain country, generally without hurry and without wasted motion, reading the ground and the fence lines and the water access points along Coldwater Creek with the systematic attention of a man building a map in his head that he intended to rely on later when conditions made visual confirmation impossible. He checked the eastern fence line twice. He rode the full perimeter of the property on the second morning alone, at a pace that allowed him to observe everything without appearing to observe anything in particular. He said very little when he came back inside, but Eliza had begun to understand that the saying very little was itself a form of communication, that the silence between Wyatt Hargrove's words was not emptiness but structure, and that what arrived after it was worth waiting for. Everett worked differently. He worked with a conversation the way a carpenter works with a good tool, naturally, and without drawing attention to the tool itself. He talked while he fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been sticking. He talked while he inspected the water troughs and the feed storage and the equipment that James had maintained with the same careful regularity evident in everything else about the ranch. He told Eliza things about the three brothers in the way that people tell things when they are not quite telling them, sideways and without ceremony, so that the information arrived before the listener had time to prepare a reaction to it. He told her that they had grown up in Idaho Territory in a small settlement near the Salmon River that was not quite a town and not quite a homestead community, but something in between, the kind of place that forms in mountain country when several families settle near each other for practical reasons and slowly develop something resembling a shared life. Their parents had died within a year of each other, their father first, their mother following in the hard winter that came after, and what remained was Wyatt at 16 and Everett at 12 and Reed at 9, and the three of them had worked out between them with the unsentimental efficiency of children who have no adults to defer to how to continue. He told her this without asking for sympathy and without performing the absence of asking for it. He told it the way you might describe a route through difficult terrain to someone who needed to understand the geography. It happened this way, and then it happened this way, and now here we are. Reed in those first 3 days operated in a different register entirely. He was present without being available, which was a distinction Eliza came to recognize as deliberate rather than antisocial. He worked with a focused intensity that required no companionship and invited no comment, and he moved through the spaces of the ranch with the unconscious precision of a man whose body had learned over a long time, and through hard instruction, to be exactly where it needed to be. She noticed early that he always sat with his back to a wall when he was inside. She noticed that he was always aware of who was in a room and where they were positioned without appearing to look at them directly. She noticed that his eyes, when they came to rest on something or someone, were not the eyes of a person looking at a thing, but the eyes of a person reading it and extracting from it whatever information it contained and filing that information away with the efficiency of someone who had learned that information was frequently the only resource that mattered. On the fourth morning, as she found what she had been looking for in the papers, the account ledgers of James Whitfield were models of clarity. He had maintained them in the manner of a man who trusted numbers and understood that numbers kept honestly would never argue with you. Every transaction recorded, every date noted, every calculation checked, and the check noted in a different ink. She had worked through them beginning with the current year and moving backward, and on the fourth morning she reached the records from the previous autumn, the point at which the pattern she had suspected began to declare itself in the language of figures and dates. The neighboring ranches had sold at prices wrong in the specific way that numbers are wrong when someone has been applying pressure that does not show up in the transaction itself. Based on the comparable valuations James had recorded in his own property assessments, the Alderman Ranch should have sold for a figure approximately 60% higher than what the transfer records showed. Crawford was worse. The Hendricks property was worse still. 3 ranches, 3 below-market sales, all within an 8-month window, all to the same buyer, whose name appeared in the transfer documentation as Coldwater Basin Development registered in the state of Illinois. She worked through the numbers a second time to be certain. She had not made an error. Then she turned to the water rights paper, the oldest thing in the drawer, and she read it with the attention it deserved. The language was legal and dense, the product of a territorial surveyor and a notary working in 1863, and it required several readings to be confident she understood it correctly. When she was confident, she sat back in James's chair and looked at the window and the mountains visible through it and thought about what she was holding. The document gave the holder of the Whitfield Ranch title primary water rights to Coldwater Creek, from its source in the mountains above to its junction with the Lower Valley watershed 15 miles to the south. Not the section of creek that ran through the ranch property. The entire creek. Every ranch in the northern range that used this water, every field and every trough and every house cistern drew from a source that this document gave the Whitfield title holder the authority to manage. Then she found the map. James had drawn it himself on a large sheet of drafting paper folded 4 times and placed inside the back cover of the oldest ledger. He had drawn it with the precision of a man who had been thinking carefully about what he was putting on paper and wanted to be certain it could not be misread. The railroad route was indicated in a single clean line running northeast to southwest across the territory. The position of Coldwater Creek was marked in blue. The point at which the railroad and the creek intersected was marked with a small circle, and inside the circle, in James Whitfield's careful handwriting, were 2 words: water rights. The circle sat in the middle of what was on this map, the Whitfield Ranch property. She brought all of it to the kitchen table that evening and laid it out the way she had learned to lay out information that needed to be understood by people who had not spent the day arriving at it, from the general to the specific, from the fact to its implication, one step at a time. She talked for 12 minutes without interruption. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of people absorbing something that changes the shape of what they thought they were dealing with. Wyatt looked at the map for a long time. He looked at it the way he looked at terrain when he was planning movement through it, seeing not just what was there, but what the relationships between things meant for what came next. Then he said, without looking up from the map, James did not build just a ranch. He built the water valve for this entire valley, and he understood what it meant to be the person who held it. Everett, looking at the transfer records. 3 ranches sold in 8 months, all below value, all to the same buyer. They were clearing the path. Toward this, Eliza said, and set her hand flat on the map over the small circle with its 2 words. Reed said nothing, but she saw him look at Wyatt, a long look that conveyed something she did not yet have the vocabulary to read, and she saw Wyatt give the smallest nod in response, the nod of a man confirming something he had already suspected but had needed to hear, described in full before he could act on it. On the second day after this conversation, Wyatt rode out before anyone else was awake. Eliza heard him in the barn from her room on the 2nd floor of the house, the muffled sounds of a horse being saddled in the dark, the familiar sequence of buckles and weight shifts, and the single firm sound of a hoof moving on packed earth. She came downstairs and found his coffee cup already rinsed and set to dry, and she put on her coat and went outside with 2 cups she had poured from the pot that was still hot on the stove. He was leading his horse out of the barn when she crossed the yard. He paused when he saw her. She offered the 2nd cup. He took it. Where are you going? And she asked, reading the tracks from the 3 properties that sold. They converge somewhere northwest. I want to see where. Lone. He drank from the cup and handed it back to her without answering the question, which was itself an answer. He mounted and rode north toward the tree line, and she stood in the yard with both cups and watched him go. What Wyatt found at the end of those converging tracks was a draw in the foothills to the northwest, 15 miles from the Whitfield Ranch, where the land folded itself into a natural shelter from the wind, and a shallow creek provided water, and the sight lines were long in three directions. It was the kind of place that men who knew mountain country chose when they intended to stay somewhere for a while without being observed from the approaches. He read the camp from the ridge above it before he descended. 10 men below, possibly 11. The count made difficult by the way the camp was arranged. The arrangement itself told him what he needed to know about the kind of men these were. The horses were positioned on the eastern side with a clear line to open country, the way people position horses when they have thought seriously about rapid departure. The watch positions were obvious once you knew what you were looking for. Two men placed where they would see any approach from the south and east before it reached them. The central fire was small as a fire could be, and still function, which meant these were people who thought about visibility. He rode down. He did not go carefully. He did not try to conceal his approach. He rode down the slope at a walk in the open, the way a man rides when he wants it understood that he is not concerned about being seen, because what he is coming to do does not require the advantage of surprise. The camp registered his approach before he was halfway down. He watched the adjustments happen, the subtle shift from resting to ready that moves through a group of experienced people like a wave, each man finding his posture and his position without being told to do so. Two hands moved toward gun grips. One man stood from where he had been sitting. The watch positions turned inward. He rode at the same pace through all of this. He stopped 20 feet from the fire where a man sat alone reading a book. Shaw was 43, lean in the way of men who move a great deal and eat when it is convenient rather than regularly, with dark eyes that moved with the methodical quality of a man who processes what he sees before he reacts to it. He looked up from the book and looked at Wyatt with those dark eyes and completed his assessment in approximately the time it takes a clock to tick once. "Wyatt Hargrove," Shaw said. "Not a question. You know my name. I do my preparation." A pause. "Three brothers, mountain country, firearms." Another pause. "Someone told me you were the most dangerous man west of the Rockies." People say things that are not accurate, and sometimes they are. To Wyatt's right, one of the men shifted his weight. His hand moved toward his gun, not quickly, not dramatically, 3 inches of deliberate movement that was intended to be noticed. Before the movement completed itself, Wyatt's right-hand Colt was out of the holster. He did not raise it. He did not aim it at the man. He held it at his side, gripped firm barrel pointing at the ground between them, and the message was entirely in the speed and not in the direction. The camp went very still. "Tell him to stop," Wyatt said to Shaw. Shaw made a gesture, economical, a single motion of 2 fingers. The man stopped. Wyatt drew the left-hand Colt. Same speed. Both guns now at his sides, both barrels toward the ground, both completely ready. He let Shaw look at this for 3 seconds, the time it required to communicate everything it was intended to communicate. Then he let the quiet work. Shaw looked at the 2 guns and looked at Wyatt's face and updated whatever calculation he had been running since the moment Wyatt appeared on the ridge. The expression on Shaw's face was not fear. It was the expression of a man who deals in assessments and had just received information that significantly revised one. "I came to make sure you could describe what you have seen to the person who hired you," Wyatt said. "Describe it accurately so that they understand what the 11th day looks like before they decide what to do with the information." Shaw said nothing for a moment. He set his book down on the log beside him, pages down, a careful gesture, the gesture of a man maintaining his composure by attending to small routines. "I will deliver that description," he said. "Good." Wyatt holstered both guns. He turned his horse. He rode out of the draw at the same walking pace he had ridden in his back to 10 armed men. His posture unchanged, the weight of his body in the saddle exactly as it had been on the way down. He did not look back. He knew they were watching him go, and he knew what they were seeing, and what they were seeing was useful information for everyone involved. Shaw came to the ranch 3 days later. He rode in alone in the mid-morning, dismounted in the yard, with the confident ease of a man accustomed to entering spaces that belong to other people, and he asked to speak with the owner of the property, not the men protecting it, the owner. He was in person exactly what the camp had suggested, a professional in the deepest sense of the word, a man who had been doing a particular kind of work for long enough that the work had shaped him as completely as mountain country shapes the men who spend decades in it. He was not unpleasant. He was not threatening in any conventional way. He was simply without warmth, the way a tool is without warmth, functional and precise, and not designed for comfort. He made his offer to Eliza with the clean efficiency of someone who had made similar offers before and knew the precise words that made them sound like opportunity rather than ultimatum. Double the assessed value of the property paid in full within 72 hours. Full assistance with transportation of personal belongings back east. No legal complications. No further contact. A clean separation with all parties receiving something they wanted. He said all of this looking at Eliza, which was the correct instinct. He had understood from whatever information he had gathered that the decision lived with her. Wyatt stood to her left and slightly behind, not in front of her and not between her and Shaw. Beside her. There was a precision to that positioning that Shaw registered because Shaw registered everything. When Eliza said nothing, Shaw added one more sentence. He said it with the same flat, even voice he had used for the offer itself, as though it were simply additional information, rather than a different kind of statement entirely. He said that it would be considerably easier for everyone involved if the woman who had come to marry James Whitfield were not present for whatever happened next. Shaw looked at Wyatt after he said this, not to gauge his reaction, to deliver a secondary message to its intended recipient. Wyatt looked back at him with an expression that had no anger in it and no fear in it and nothing dramatic at all, only the steadiness of a man who has already decided what he is willing to do and is at complete peace with that decision. "You were at the camp," Shaw said. "You knew I would come." "I expected it, yes." A pause. "I described what I saw to the people who need to know it. And they sent you here anyway." "They did." Shaw held his gaze for a moment. "Which should tell you something about how much they want this property, Hargrove." "It tells me the information was not sufficient," Wyatt said, "that they need to see the next part before they make their final decision." Shaw looked at him for one more second, completing whatever final calculation he was running. Then he mounted his horse and rode out of the yard at the same unhurried pace he had ridden in, and the quality of his departure was the quality of a man who has received information and will use it, but is not yet done with the matter. It was the evening of that same day when Reed sat at the kitchen table while Eliza was going through the papers and said without preamble and without looking up from the curtain he was holding, "We had a sister named Ada, 6 years younger than me." Eliza set down the document she was reading. She waited. Wyatt was 25. I was 18. We were gone 3 days on a hunting run up into the northern range. He paused. He turned the coffee cup in his hands in a slow rotation that was not quite deliberate and not quite unconscious. "Someone came to the settlement while we were gone." He did not say what happened. He did not need to say what happened because the shape of the sentence made the shape of the event clear enough without the specific words. "Ada is in Boston now," he said, "a convent on Harbor Street. Her aunt manages the arrangement. She does not write to us anymore." Eliza was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not absence, but its opposite, a full attention, that knows the difference between speaking and filling silence. "I know that convent," she said. "I know the aunt as well, from my years in the city." She paused. "She is not a warm woman, but she is not a cruel one. Ada is looked after properly in the limits of what that place can offer." Reed looked up from the coffee. He looked at her with the direct, undeflected attention he brought to things that were actually important, and she saw in that look something that had not been present in the previous days. Not softness exactly, not gratitude, something more like a recalibration, an adjustment to the category into which she had been placed. He nodded once, then he picked up his coffee and drank from it, and the conversation was over in the way that conversations with Reed were over when they were over cleanly and without ceremony. Henry Marsh arrived on the 12th day. He rode in from the south in the late morning alone on a horse that had been ridden hard and regularly over a long distance, and he carried with him the particular exhaustion of a man who had been working alone on a problem for a long time and had finally reached the point where working alone was no longer sufficient. He was 38 from the Federal Land Office in Helena, and he had been tracking the Chicago Consortium's Montana operation for 4 months. He told them this at the kitchen table with the directness of a man who had stopped having time for indirection. The legislative vote was 35 days out, the deadline the consortium was working against. The legal mechanism that would give the railroad consortium an arguable claim to eminent domain acquisition of the water rights required that they establish operational control of the source property before the vote. After it, if they prevailed, the law could be used to take what persuasion and pressure had failed to secure. And then he told them the part that changed the weight of everything else. James Whitfield had contacted the Federal Land Office 3 months before his death. He had been gathering documentation. He had been building a case from the western end that would have given Marsh the connection he needed to close the chain from Chicago to Coldwater Station. Danton had known. The consortium had known. The death of James Whitfield was not a consequence of their land acquisition strategy. It was a precondition of it. They had removed him not because he was in the way of the property transfer, but because he was in the way of the documentation. Whoever had known enough about James Whitfield's habits and movements to arrange something that looked convincingly like an accident was someone who knew this ground. Not someone from outside, someone from inside, or someone with a long and close relationship with the inside. The name sat in the room without being spoken. Wyatt felt it the way you feel a weight you have been carrying when you set it down and find it heavier than you thought. He thought about 4 years ago, and a man with red hair and a scar on the left side of his jaw, who knew the mountain passages the way Wyatt knew them, and had been for a period someone he had trusted with the kind of trust that mountain men extend to the people they work with in dangerous country, which is not a small trust and is not extended casually. Fletcher. He did not say the name, but the others had heard enough now to fill in the shape of the silence around it, and what they read in his face when he finally looked up told them the rest. The night of the 18th day arrived with a clarity that mountain nights sometimes have. In September, the air gone cold and perfectly still, and the stars overhead so numerous and so bright that they seemed to be doing something deliberate. Wyatt had moved his sleeping position to the sitting room on the ground floor 4 days earlier. Everett had made a corresponding adjustment to where he slept relative to the barn. Reed had been on the ridge above the eastern approach each night since the 4th day, sleeping in the position he had chosen when he first surveyed the ground. The horses told Wyatt first. He was sitting in the chair in the sitting room, not asleep, when he heard the shift in the sound from the corral, the change in breathing that meant the animals had perceived something beyond what the human senses were yet registering. He was outside and in position before the first figure appeared on the northern ridge. There were 4 of them. They came in from the northwest, which offered the most cover until the last 200 yards. They did not come in shooting. They came in with the controlled purposefulness of people who had been given specific instructions about what this particular visit was meant to accomplish. 2 shots into the upper section of the barn, high enough to be unmistakable as deliberate and low enough to avoid the horses. 2 horses from the paddock driven off into the dark. The kitchen garden along the south wall worked over systematically with the heels of boots. The eastern fence line near where James had died had 3 posts pulled and the wire cut. Then they were gone. Reed wanted to follow. The energy in him that was always present and always contained had come partially uncontained in the way that sudden nights do to people who are prepared to act and have not been able to act. And he stood at the edge of the yard, looking north into the darkness, with the specific posture of a man who knows where he wants to go and is only waiting for the word. No, Wyatt said. They are still close enough to... No. He said it the second time with the same even weight as the first, not louder, not harder, not different in any way except that it was the second time, which with Wyatt meant what it always meant. Outside is their ground tonight. We do not fight on someone else's ground in the dark when we do not have full information. Reed stood for another moment at the edge of the yard looking north. Then he came back. Wyatt stood in the middle of the yard thinking, reading what had happened against what he knew and what he suspected, aligning the night's events with the shape of everything else. When he came inside, he said it directly. They sent 4 men to see how we respond. Now they know. They will come next with enough people that they do not have to guess about the outcome. We have perhaps 12 days, no more than that. The next morning, Eliza wrote the letter. She wrote it at James's desk with his pen and his ink, and she wrote it to a lawyer in Helena, whose name she had found in James's address book, a man named Wallace, who had witnessed the water rights documentation in 1863 and was still, according to the records, practicing. She laid out the situation in precise sequential language. She described the mail order arrangement in the 6 months of correspondence, in the date of her arrival, in the circumstances of James's death. She cited the territorial law that governed inheritance rights in completed mail order arrangements. She noted that her arrangement had not been completed by ceremony, but argued that the ceremony had been prevented by homicide rather than by any failure of intent, and that the documentation of intent was thorough and dated and available for examination. She requested formal recognition of her claim to the Whitfield property and water rights, pending investigation of the circumstances of James's death. She enclosed copies of the relevant correspondence, the financial records she had assembled, and a statement of witness signed by Wyatt Everett and Reed Hargrove, attesting to the circumstances of her arrival and the evidence of wrongdoing they had collectively observed. She sealed the letter and asked Everett, who was riding to town for supplies, to send it by the fastest available post. She gave Wyatt the copy she had kept to read after Everett had gone. She watched him read it sitting across the kitchen table. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her and said, intelligent. Read from his position near the wall, and reckless. Intelligent and reckless tend to travel together, she said. James understood that. It is why he wrote to Boston instead of somewhere closer. Wyatt looked at the letter on the table and then at Eliza. And in the quality of that look, she saw something that had not been present in his first assessment of her in the coffee house. Something that had accumulated slowly across the weight of these days together. Something that had to do with recognition in its fullest sense. Not just identifying what a person was, but understanding what they were made of. That evening, the last calm evening, for some time the 4 of them went outside after dinner without any particular reason for doing so, and stood in the yard in the cold and looked at the sky. Everett asked what she would do with the ranch when this was finished. She thought about it for a moment. Build it, the way James intended it to be built. He called it Whitfield when he named it. I will keep that name. Why? Everett said. Because it was his before it was mine. And now it is mine. Both of those things can be true at the same time. They do not cancel each other out. Nobody spoke for a while. She was aware of Wyatt standing to her right and slightly behind her, not looking at her, but at the mountains to the north. And she was aware that he was seeing something up there that she did not yet have the experience to see. She did not try to see what he was seeing. She looked at the creek instead, at the silver movement of water in the starlight. And she thought about James Whitfield building 15 years of careful work around this single unceasing fact. The preparations for what was coming had the quality of all serious preparations, which is to say they were quiet and they were methodical, and they carried within them the specific weight of work being done by people who understand that thoroughness in advance is the only honest substitute for certainty about outcome. Wyatt organized them in the 3 days following Marsh's visit, not with dramatic instruction, but with the particular economy of a man who has already worked out in his mind what needs to be done and is now simply communicating the conclusions of that work to people he trusts to execute it. He had been mapping the geometry of the ranch in darkness since the first morning, noting the angles in the cover and the distances from likely approach routes to the structures that needed protecting. He knew which position gave the longest sight line to the north. He knew which position could cover the western approach without being visible from the road. He knew the one blind spot, the corner where the northwest wall of the house met the outbuilding, at an angle that created a pocket of approach invisible from ground level on three sides. Everett took the barn. It was the right position for him, and they both knew it. The barn sat at the western edge of the yard with a wall that faced the road and a loft that gave clear elevation over the approach from the southwest. More importantly, Everett had spent the preceding 10 days constructing with the patient ingenuity he brought to problems that required thinking through, rather than forcing through a system of wire and small bells strung along the three most likely approach paths at a height of approximately 18 inches from the ground. The wire was thin enough to be invisible in darkness and strung loosely enough that an animal might push through it without triggering the bells, but a man moving at any pace would not. He had tested each section himself on his hands and knees in the dark, confirming the sensitivity with the care of a man who understood that the value of a warning system was precisely proportional to its reliability. Reed went to the rock formation on the northern ridge. He had chosen this position on the first day and had returned to it at night 3 times since sleeping in the notch between the 2 largest stones, with his rifle across his knees, accustoming himself to the sound and the air and the sight lines of that particular piece of ground in darkness. A man who knows his position in the dark knows it in a way that a man who only knows it in daylight does not. The discussion about Eliza in the basement happened on the afternoon of the second preparation day and lasted approximately 4 minutes. Wyatt put the matter plainly. The basement was solid below ground level, accessible through a door in the kitchen floor that was thick enough to muffle sound from above. It was the safest position on the property for someone who was not part of the defensive arrangement. Eliza listened to this without expression. Then she picked up the rifle that Wyatt had given her on the 6th day of their stay, when he had spent 20 minutes teaching her 4 things about its operation, and nothing else on the grounds that 4 things known well were worth more than 20 things known partially. She held the rifle correctly because she had practiced holding it correctly every morning since the 6th day, working the 4 things he had taught her until they were in her hands rather than in her head. She held it, and she looked at him. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle and at her hands on it and at her face, which was doing what her face did when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for the conversation to locate itself in the same place her decision already was. He said the northwest corner. She waited. There is a pocket at the northwest corner of the house where the wall meets the outbuilding. From ground level, it is not visible from the main approaches. From the second floor window at the end of the hall, it is visible clearly. He paused. It is the one position I cannot cover from the yard. If someone moves through that pocket toward the rear of the house, I will not see them. But you need someone who will. Yes, she nodded once, the nod she gave when a thing was settled. One shot into the wall above the pocket, he said. Not into the pocket, into the wall above, and to the left of it. It will stop forward movement and create a position disclosure that Everett can work from when he clears the eastern side. I understand. If there is no movement in that pocket, you fire nothing, not for any other reason. Only that. I understand, she said again. He looked at her for one more moment, completing an assessment and finding the result satisfactory. Then he moved on to the next thing, and that was the end of the conversation. On the morning of what Wyatt had calculated as the day before the attack, a horse appeared on the northern ridge. It was early, the light still gray and thin, the air carrying the particular cold of mountain mornings in late September. Wyatt was already in the yard. He saw the horse on the ridge, and he saw the man on the horse, and he read both in the same 3-second assessment he brought to everything that appeared on a horizon. The man was riding with his hands visible. He was riding at a walk, and he was not riding to the side or to the cover that a man coming with bad intentions would naturally ride toward. He was riding directly in the open to the center of the approach. Wyatt stood in the yard and waited. Reed had the man and his rifle's attention from the northern position before the horse cleared the ridge. Everett appeared in the barn doorway with a posture that communicated readiness without aggression. William Fletcher rode into the yard at a walk and stopped 20 feet from Wyatt and sat his horse with his hands open and in front of him, the deliberate posture of a man who has thought carefully about what posture to arrive in. 4 years had done what 4 years do to a man living hard in hard country, when those years are the kind that age a man faster than ordinary time. His red hair had gone to red and silver in approximately equal parts, and the scar on the left side of his jaw had settled into the kind of scar that stops being notable and becomes simply part of a face. He was lean in the way of men who have been burning more than they could easily replace, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who had been looking at a decision for a long time and had finally made it and was now living in the clarity that comes after. "I did not come to fight," Fletcher said. "I know that," Wyatt said. "If you had come to fight, you would not have come in the daylight." A silence. "They are coming tonight," Fletcher said. "Not in 3 days. Danton changed the plan when he learned about the federal investigation. Tonight, 10 men. Shaw leads them." Wyatt said nothing immediately. He stood with this information the way he stood with all information, taking it in without reacting to it, letting it settle into the structure of what he already knew until it found its correct position. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Fletcher looked at the ranch house. He looked at the barn and the fence lines and the south pasture where James Whitfield's cattle were moving in the morning light. He looked at all of it for a moment with the expression of a man looking at something he has damaged and can not repair, only partially compensate for. "James Whitfield knew me before I became what I became," he said. "What I have done cannot be undone, I know that. But this what happens tonight I can choose not to do." He said it plainly and without theater, the way a plain man says a plain thing when he has finished weighing it and found it true. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the 4 years between them and what those 4 years contained in the specific weight of something that had happened in that time and had never been fully settled, a thing that lived between these two men, the way certain things live between people who have been through dangerous work together, permanently present and permanently unresolved. Wyatt looked at Fletcher for a long time. "Go," he said. "We are square." Fletcher looked at him once more, completing whatever he needed to complete. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, north and east toward the tree line and the passes beyond it, and he did not look back. Everett waited until the horse had disappeared into the trees. "Do you trust him?" "Yes." "Why, Baum?" "Because he did not need to come here." Wyatt turned back toward the house. "Start the day. Everything moves up." The night came in without a moon. This was not coincidence. A man who plans the movement of people through defended ground chooses the darkest available night, and the darkest available night in late September in Montana territory, with the moon in its new phase, is dark enough that a man 20 feet away from you is a shape and a sound rather than a face and a name. Reed had been on the northern ridge since sundown. He had eaten in the late afternoon and checked his ammunition and climbed the ridge in the last of the light and settled into the notch between the 2 stones that he had slept in 3 times already and knew with his body rather than his eyes. Everett was in the barn. The bells were strung. He had positioned himself in the loft with a clear angle on the western approach and a second angle through a gap he had made in the planking on the yard itself. Eliza was at the hallway window on the 2nd floor. She had been there since full dark. She could see the northwest corner of the house clearly. From this position, the pocket of approach that Wyatt had described. And she had done what he had told her to do. She watched it and nothing else. Not the yard, not the ridge, not the road. The pocket. She held the rifle in the position she had practiced, and she breathed the way she had taught herself to breathe, and she waited. Wyatt was in the yard. He had chosen the center of the yard not from habit or from drama, but because it was the correct tactical position for a man trying to cover two primary angles of approach simultaneously. What he gave up was cover. He had made that calculation and accepted the outcome of it. His horse was in the corral, and the horse was the first to know. As the horse was always the first to know, the ears rotating forward in the particular way they rotated, and the animal was registering something that the human nose and ears had not yet reached. Wyatt felt the change in the horse before he heard anything himself. He was already moving to position when the first bell rang. Everett's bell from the western wire, then within seconds the second bell from the northern approach wire, which meant the main group was coming from the north, as Fletcher had said, and a secondary group was already working the western side. 10 men split and coordinated. The northern group appeared at the fence line with the organized spacing of people who had done this before, 4 men with the interval between them of a practiced approach formation, moving at the kind of controlled pace that covers ground without creating the sound of running. Behind them, further back, directing rather than leading, a shape that Wyatt recognized by its stillness even at this distance. Shaw. Reed fired twice from the northern ridge. He did not fire at the approaching men. He fired at the horses of the 2 men at the far flanks of the northern formation, not to injure the animals, but to create the sound and the reaction at the most disruptive points in the line. Both shots landed where Reed put them into the ground immediately before the hooves of each animal, close enough to stop forward movement and create the kind of lateral reaction in a horse that breaks the formation of anyone riding or moving beside it. The northern approach lost its organization. Not fully, not permanently, but for the 15 seconds that followed Reed's shots, the 4 men at the front were each managing a separate situation rather than operating as a coordinated line. Wyatt used the 15 seconds. He moved through the yard with the complete economy of a man whose body has learned over many years to do exactly and only what the situation requires. His right-hand Colt was in his hand. The 2 men at the front of the northern approach had recovered their footing and were bringing weapons up, and the distance between them and Wyatt was now inside 30 feet. He fired twice, not rapidly, but precisely in the specific rhythm of a man who fires when he is certain, and not before, and both men went down. 2 men from the rear of the northern group changed their angles to create crossing approaches, the standard response to the loss of forward elements, and these 2 were moving well and had understood their options correctly, which made them the most dangerous element of the northern approach. From the western side, Everett's bell had rung twice more in quick succession, then stopped. Then Everett's short rifle fired once, and then again. And the quality of the shots, the spacing, and the flat authority of them told Wyatt that Everett had the western approach managed. The 2 men from the rear of the northern group were 15 feet out and closing when Wyatt used the left Colt. He moved to his left. In the same instant, he fired the step in the shot simultaneous, in the way that things become simultaneous after enough repetition, and the man on the right went down. The man on the left adjusted quickly, which was quick thinking under pressure, and fired, and the shot went through the space where Wyatt had been standing rather than the space where Wyatt now was. The left Colt answered. 4 men down from the northern approach. The remaining 2 from that group stopped. Not retreating, but stopped the stop of men reassessing a situation that had resolved differently than they had planned. Wyatt turned toward the northwest corner of the house. The pocket of approach was there, and 2 men from what had been Shaw's reserve were moving through it with the careful, controlled movement of people who had been told exactly where to go and had been waiting for the yard engagement to occupy the primary defender's attention. They were good. They had timed it correctly. They were 12 feet from the rear of the house when the rifle shot came from the second-floor window above and to the left of them into the stone wall of the outbuilding. The shot stopped them. It stopped them because a shot from a position they had not accounted for stops people, not because it hit anything it was aimed at, and in the 3 seconds that followed, Everett came around the east corner of the barn from behind them with his second pistol. Shaw had not moved. He had been standing at the back of the northern formation through all of it, watching the resolution of his deployment with the contained, methodical attention of a man who is not directing what he sees but evaluating it against the calculation he had been running from the beginning, the long calculation about cost and return, and the point at which a contract stops being worth executing. He walked into the yard alone. His hands were not on his guns. Wyatt stood in the center of the yard, both Colts holstered, reloaded, 15 feet between them. I have seen a great many defended properties, Shaw said. His voice was even the same voice he had used when he made the offer to Eliza in this same yard. I have never seen one defended like this. Now you have. Shaw looked at the yard. He looked at the men down and at the northwest pocket where Everett stood. He looked at Reed descending from the northern ridge with the unhurried stride of a man whose position is no longer required. He looked at the second floor window where the rifle had fired. This contract, Shaw said, has reached the limit of what it is worth to me. He paused. I have been doing this work for 18 years. I know when to stop. The people who hired you will not be satisfied. The people who hired me are not in the range of your guns tonight. Another pause. You do what you do well, Hargrove. I have been at this long enough not to die for something that has stopped being worth the price. Wyatt said nothing. He looked at Shaw with the even settled attention he brought to all things, and Shaw looked back at him with the professional acknowledgement of one man for another when both of them understand that the situation has been resolved. Shaw turned. The men still standing from the original deployment fell in behind him, and they walked back the way they had come north and west into the dark that had held them an hour ago, and now gave them back to the country that had sent them. Wyatt stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats move away, the sound diminishing steadily into the clean, cold silence of the Montana night, until there was nothing left of them but the silence itself. Reed reached the yard, then Everett from the east side of the barn, then Eliza from the house coming down the porch steps with the rifle held correctly at her side, and her face doing what it did when she was managing something that required management. The four of them stood in the yard in the darkness before dawn. Everett had a long cut along his left forearm from a piece of wood that had shattered when something had struck the barn wall near him. He was holding it with his right hand in the practical way of a man noting an injury and filing it under things to deal with shortly. Eliza went to him without being asked. She took his arm and examined the cut with the focused efficiency of someone who had dealt with household injuries for years and understood the difference between the kinds that needed serious attention and the kinds that needed cleaning and wrapping and time. She dealt with it without fuss. Everett looked at the top of her head while she worked and said nothing. Reed looked at Wyatt. Wyatt gave the small nod that meant what it had always meant between them. Reed returned the nod. Then he looked at Eliza and held that look for a moment longer than he usually held looks at things, and Wyatt saw in it the updated assessment of someone who had expected one thing and found another. The dawn came with the slow amber patience of late September dawns, the sky going from black to gray to the particular color that precedes actual light, and it was in this color before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge that Henry Marsh appeared on the road from the south. He had ridden north at the kind of pace a man rides when the timeline of something important has suddenly compressed. Victor Danton had left Coldwater Station at midnight. He had a 3-hour lead. He was riding toward Helena, toward the road that crossed Mountain Pass, toward a meeting with a judge named Calvin Holt, who was, as Marsh had learned in the past 72 hours through the federal documentation chain, not an impartial party to the consortium's activities in Montana Territory. If Danton reached Holt before Marsh's records were complete and formally filed, the documentation chain could be interrupted in ways that would take months to untangle and might never fully recover. Mountain Pass was one road, one way through, one point of control. Who knows that pass, Marsh said. Reed was already moving toward the corral. Wyatt said, not alone. Reed turned. The look he gave his oldest brother was not argument. It was the look of a man presenting the logic of a situation to someone he respects enough to lay it out plainly. You need to be here. Everett is hurt. I know that pass better than anyone alive because you taught me it 10 years ago. The logic was correct. Wyatt stood with it for the 3 seconds it took to confirm that the logic was correct. He looked at Eliza. This was the moment she identified afterward, in the days that followed, as the one that had changed the texture of what existed between them. He looked at her before he gave Reed the word. Not at Everett, not at Marsh, at her. In the way that a person looks at someone they have decided without ceremony or announcement to consult. She gave him the nod. Small and certain. He looked at Reed. Go. Reed was on his horse and moving before the word was fully in the air. Mountain Pass in the early morning was the kind of place that made men understand why certain terrain has been contested for as long as there have been men willing to contest it. The pass was a corridor between two rock faces, the gap between them at its narrowest point approximately 20 feet across, with walls that rose 30 feet on either side, and forced anyone moving through it into a single file that gave the advantages of position entirely to whoever happened to be already there. Reed knew this pass the way Wyatt had taught him to know it, which was to know it in all conditions, and not only the conditions in which he had first encountered it. He had ridden it in snow and in full dark, and he had ridden the trail that ran above it along the eastern face, the trail that was not on any survey map, because it had been made by mountain goats and maintained by the occasional man who found it and understood what it offered. He took the goat trail. He was in position at the narrowest point of the pass with 30 minutes to spare his horse, tied back along the eastern face himself settled into the gap between two outcroppings, with the rifle and the patience he had developed over years of exactly this kind of waiting, when he heard the first sound of approaching horses from the south. Danton was traveling with 3 men, professional men who rode with the specific readiness of people being paid to ensure that the person they were riding with arrived somewhere safely. They entered the pass at a canter, working to the timeline they had set and confident in it. They came around the first bend and found Reed standing in the middle of the pass with his rifle in his hands. They pulled up hard, and then from the northern end of the pass, another horse appeared. Fletcher had been there before Reed. He had taken the direct road over a trail that ran 2 miles further east than the goat path and was faster than anything else available on that terrain, a trail that James Whitfield had apparently shown Fletcher during the years when Fletcher was a different man than he had become. He was standing his horse at the northern end of the pass with his hands in front of him, visible not on any weapon. In one hand he held a brown leather notebook. Reed looked at him. You were here before me. I know a faster road, Fletcher said. James showed it to me before. The before carried everything it needed to carry without further specification. Danton's 3 men had assessed the situation and arrived at the conclusion that situations arrive at when examined honestly. They were in a 20-foot corridor with rock walls on both sides and armed men at both ends, and no geometry that favored movement in any direction. Danton himself was a man in his late 50s who looked in the pale morning light of the past like what he actually was, not a man of violence, but a man of transactions. Someone who had spent his career arranging things from a comfortable distance and was now present at the physical end of his arrangements in a way he had clearly not expected to be. The notebook was what mattered, and everyone in the past understood it was what mattered, the way everyone in a room understands the most important thing in the room, even when nobody says it. Fletcher had carried it for 4 months. It contained the correspondence between Danton and Judge Calvin Holt, written in the plain language of men who expected their correspondence to remain private, which left very little to inference. It contained the meeting notes from 3 sessions of the consortium's board in Chicago, at which the Montana Territory acquisition strategy had been discussed in terms that were specific enough to constitute documentation of intent. And it contained in Danton's own handwriting, on 4 pages in the back, the instructions that had been given regarding James Whitfield and the timeline around which those instructions had been organized. I held on to it because I did not know what to do with it until I did, Fletcher said, and he said it to Reed rather than to Danton. There is no use for something like this except the right, and the right use has to wait until the right moment. He held the notebook out, and Reed crossed the pass and took it. "We are square," Reed said, because Wyatt had said those words and Reed trusted Wyatt's accounting. Fletcher looked at him for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back through the northern end of the pass and out of sight, and the sound of his horse faded into the quiet of the mountains, and he did not come back. The legal resolution of the Coldwater Creek matter took 11 days from the morning of the battle to the filing of the final federal documentation in Helena. Marsh worked through those 11 days with the intensity of a man who had been waiting 4 months for the material he now had and was not going to waste a day of it. The notebook provided the Eastern connection. Wyatt's testimony and the financial records that Eliza had assembled from James's ledgers provided the Western connection. The water rights documentation certified by Wallace and Helena established the legal standing of Eliza Harper's claim to the Whitfield property and its associated rights as clearly as any document in Montana Territory could establish anything. Victor Danton was held in federal custody in Helena pending trial. The proceedings against him included charges that went beyond the land acquisition strategy to the earlier matter. The matter that had been called an accident and filed away. The matter that the notebook's final 4 pages addressed with the specificity that Danton had not anticipated would ever be read by anyone positioned to act on it. Judge Calvin Holt was suspended from his position pending investigation of his communications with Danton. The consortium's representatives withdrew their legislative registration filing 4 days before the territorial vote, offering no public explanation, which was itself a kind of explanation. And Sheriff Earl Boone of Coldwater Station was arrested on a Tuesday morning by a federal marshal who had ridden in from the west, which was the direction nobody in Coldwater Station had been watching for federal marshals to arrive from. The gold pocket watch was itemized in the arrest documentation. So were 6 months of cash deposits into an account at the Territorial Bank in an amount consistent with the payments recorded in Danton's notebook for the maintenance of a cooperative local law enforcement presence. Boone had been in the accounting of the notebook a line item, an operational expense, something purchased and maintained and eventually in the way of all purchased things made to answer for the price. The arrest of Boone was the event that changed the quality of Coldwater Station in a way that the federal proceedings in Helena, distant and official, did not quite manage on its own. When the man who was supposed to stand between the community and the wrong things turned out to be standing on the wrong side of that line, the community had to decide what to do with the knowledge of that. 3 of the ranchers who had sold their properties came back to town within the same week to speak with Marsh about their legal options. They were told that the options were limited but present, that the investigation would take time, that nothing could be promised, but nothing was foreclosed. They seemed to understand this the way people understand things they have been waiting to hear for long enough that the hearing of them, even imperfect, is something. The water rights to Coldwater Creek were confirmed in the name of Eliza Harper, holder of the Whitfield Ranch title, by a judge in Helena who was not Judge Hole. It was a formal document. It arrived in a sealed envelope from the territorial capital, and Eliza opened it at the kitchen table while Wyatt and Everett and Reed sat around her, each of them doing something with their hands, the way people do things with their hands when they are waiting for the resolution of something and do not want to appear to be waiting. She read it once. Then she folded it and set it flat on the table and put her hand flat on top of it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Everett said, "Well, that was sufficient." The days after the legal resolution had a different quality from all the days before them. The specific quality of days that follow the end of something that has required sustained effort for a long time. Not the quality of celebration, which tends to be loud and brief, but the quality of settling, which is quiet and gradual and takes longer than the effort itself. Everett stayed. He made no announcement and offered no explanation. He simply continued to be present on the ranch in the morning when Eliza came downstairs, and continued to be doing something useful when she looked for him during the day, and continued to sit at the kitchen table in the evenings, as though the kitchen table were a place he had always sat. He repaired the barn door hinge that had been sticking since the second day. He worked through the equipment in the storage shed and identified what needed replacing and began the process of replacing it. He was competent with animals and with wood and with the practical problems of running a working property which was a form of competence that the Whitfield Ranch was going to need in large quantities for the foreseeable future. She had not asked him to stay. He had not offered to stay. The staying had simply organized itself the way the rhythm of the first 3 days had organized itself according to necessity and availability rather than deliberate arrangement. Reed stayed also, but differently. He moved through the ranch with the same focused purpose he always had, but there was something altered in the way he occupied the space. She noticed it first when she came out of the house one morning and found him standing at the edge of the yard, looking south along the line of Coldwater Creek, his hands in his pockets and his weight evenly distributed, the posture not of a man surveying, but of a man simply being somewhere without immediate reason to be anywhere else. It was a new posture for him. In all the weeks she had observed him, Reed Hargrove had always had a reason for his position. He was always where he was because the position served a purpose. This was different. He was standing by the creek because the creek was there and the morning was clear, and there was, for the moment, nowhere he was required to be. She did not interrupt it. She let him have it, the small and private experiment of a man trying out the experience of belonging somewhere, testing it carefully as you test ice before you trust your way to it. The ranch settled into itself. The cattle were managed, the accounts were opened and organized, and the supply situation was assessed. There were hands to hire and fences to properly repair, and the business of a working cattle operation to attend to, and the attending required the kind of systematic, long-horizon thinking that Eliza had been developing through weeks of working James's records and understanding what he had built and why. She was not James. She did not try to be James. But she worked with the same respect for the systems he had established, modifying them where her own judgment told her modification was warranted, and preserving them where the record showed they had served well. And the result was a ranch that was beginning in the small, daily ways that constitute the actual substance of a going concern to move forward. The conversation with Wyatt on the porch happened on the 8th evening after the battle. She had known it was coming the way certain things are coming when you have been paying attention to a person long enough to understand the grammar of their silences. He had been quieter in those 8 days than he had been at any point since their arrival. A different quality of quiet from his ordinary quiet turned inward rather than outward. Not reading the situation around him, but reading something inside himself that required more sustained attention than anything the outside world was currently presenting. The evening was clear and cold. The fire inside had burned down and neither of them had moved to add to it, and eventually they had moved out to the porch in the wordless way they sometimes move from one place to another without having discussed it, following the same logic to the same destination. The mountains to the north were dark shapes against a sky that was holding its last light above the western ridge, and the creek was audible from where they sat. That constant sound that had stopped being background and become simply the voice of the place. "Do you remember what it felt like to have a home?" she asked. He was quiet in the way of a man thinking about a question seriously rather than searching for the response that the question seemed to want. "Our home in Idaho was burned when I was 16, he said. "I do not mean that as a metaphor." She did not say she was sorry. She had learned enough by now to know that sorrow expressed after the fact about events that could not be altered was more for the comfort of the person expressing it than for the benefit of the person hearing it. And Wyatt Hargrove was not a man who needed to be comforted about the past at the expense of accuracy about the present. They sat for a while. The creek ran. The mountains held their shapes against the darkening sky. "James Whitfield was the best man I have known," he said. "I should have come sooner." "You came when you were able to come. That is not the same as soon enough." "You came when you needed to come," she said, and there was a difference in this. From the first version, she had offered a distinction that was not softening but precision, and she meant it as precision rather than comfort. Not sooner, at the right time. He looked at her. The specific quality of that look, which was not the assessing look he used for situations or the watchful look he used for approaches, but something without a tactical function, without any purpose except the purpose of seeing clearly, had appeared only occasionally in the weeks she had known him, and each time had been notable for its difference from every other kind of attention he brought to the world. James put my name on that letter, he said. Not because I was the best man he knew with a firearm. He put my name on it because he believed I was the kind of man who would not leave when leaving was the easier thing. He paused. I think he would have been surprised by you. She held that for a moment, turned it over. He would not have been surprised, she said. He chose carefully. He always chose carefully. Everything about this ranch tells you that. The last light went from the ridge. The mountains became simply darkness and shape against the stars that were beginning to appear. She could hear Reed in the barn, the sound of a horse being settled for the night, the quiet, familiar sounds of the end of a day on a working property. She thought about the creek, still running, still running the way it had run for every day of James Whitfield's 15 years of building, for every day of the dispute and the fear and the legal maneuvering and the violence, for every day before any of that, and for every day still to come, regardless of what any of them arranged or failed to arrange. I will come back, Wyatt said. She turned to look at him. The look she gave him was not soft and was not hopeful. It was the look she gave everything that mattered, direct, even requiring of the thing it was looking at, the same honesty it had brought to the looking. Do not say that if you do not mean it, she said. I mean it. She held his gaze for a moment longer. What she was looking for she found. What she found was sufficient. She nodded once. He left before first light, as she had known he would. She heard him in the barn from her room, the sounds she had come to know as his sounds, the particular sequence of preparation that belonged to him and not to either of his brothers, and she lay in the dark and listened to them, and then she got up and dressed and went downstairs. She made 2 cups of coffee from the pot that was still warm. She put on her coat and she went outside. He was leading his horse out of the barn when she crossed the yard. He stopped when he saw her. She offered the 2nd cup. He took it. They stood in the yard in the dark before dawn, and they drank the coffee without talking, the way people who have shared the specific intimacy of hard circumstances sometimes stand together in silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because what is worth saying is already present and does not require words to be true. The mountains to the north were beginning to acquire their edges in the first gray suggestion of light that precedes the actual dawn by approximately 30 minutes, and belongs to neither the night nor the morning, but to the brief time between them that has no good name. Everett and Reed will stay, he said. I know. They will be well here, both of them. I know that too. A pause, the creek running, the horses in the corral shifting. There are places that need what I do, he said. I know that. It is not about this place. It is not about you. I know that as well. He looked north. She watched him look north, and she could see in his face the country he was already moving through. In his mind, the passes and the high ground and the long, cold silences that had been his home for 12 years. The home that was not a place, but a condition, a way of being in the world that was as much a part of him as the way he breathed or the way he stood. I will come back, he said. She looked at him steadily. Do not say it if you do not mean it. I said it once already tonight. Say it again. I mean it, he said. I have said things in my life that I did not intend to keep. This is not one of those things. She nodded, once, the nod she gave when a thing was settled. He finished the coffee and handed her the cup and swung into the saddle in the single fluid motion of a man who had been getting onto horses in the dark for most of his adult life. He did not look at her again from the saddle. He sat for one moment with the horse finding its balance, and then he rode north toward the tree line, toward the passes, toward the long country that had shaped him and that he knew better than any other thing in the world. She stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats until she could not hear them anymore. Then she went upstairs. She went to the room at the end of the hall, the room with the window that faced north, and she lit the small lamp on the window ledge, and she set it in the center of the sill, where it would be visible from the road and from the approaches and from the ridge and from anywhere north of the house where a man on a horse might pause and look back. Not as a signal, not as an invitation, simply as a light. Simply as the evidence that a place was here and inhabited and continuing, that the creek was still running and the lamp was still burning, and the land that James Whitfield had spent 15 years building his life around was still being looked after by someone who understood what it was worth and what it had and what it meant. Wyatt Hargrove stopped at the top of the first rise north of the ranch, the point where the road crested before the long descent into the mountain approaches the point where the Whitfield Ranch was still visible below in the early dark. He stopped without deciding to stop the horse, reading the slight shift in his weight and responding to it, and he looked back. The lamp was in the window, small and yellow in the dark before dawn, a single point of warm light against the shape of the house and the mountains behind it, and the vast cold territory of stars above everything. He looked at it for a time that was longer than he could have accounted for. He thought about James Whitfield and the letter written 6 weeks before a death that had been called an accident by a man with a gold watch and the name on the envelope underlined once, and everything that the underlining had contained in its small, careful insistence. He thought about what it meant to be trusted with something, not to be capable of something, not to be sufficient for something, but to be trusted with something which was a different kind of asking altogether. He thought about the creek, still running below him in the dark, the sound of it carrying, even at this distance, that clear, constant note that the country of the northern range would be diminished without, and that an entire valley depended on, and that would continue to run regardless of what any of them arranged or failed to arrange, carrying the water down from the mountains the way water has always carried itself down from mountains, without haste and without pause and without memory for the outcomes of any of the human disputes arranged along its banks. He thought about a lamp in a window that nobody had asked anyone to light. He turned his horse north and rode into the pass, and the light in the window disappeared behind the rise of the land, and ahead of him the mountains stood in their enormous patience, waiting to receive him, as they had always received him, without judgment and without condition, simply as the country that country was. He would go where he was needed. He would do what he did. He would come back when the road and the season and the people who needed what he could offer had been attended to, and he would come back knowing that the lamp would be there, that the creek would be running, that the thing James Whitfield had spent 15 years building and had trusted to the right people to continue had been continued, that the water valve of the Northern Valley was held by a woman who understood what holding it meant. He rode north. The mountains took him in. Behind him, 12 miles south in the valley, Coldwater Creek ran on in the darkness as it had always run, as it would run still. Not for the consortium in Chicago, not for the railroad surveyors with their instruments and their calculations, not for the men who had come to take it and found that taking it cost more than they were willing to pay. For the ranches in the northern range that would survive the dry years because the water was there. For the community that would grow or fail or change according to the ordinary rhythms of its own choices, free of the thumb of men from distant cities who had decided that what belonged to this valley ought to belong to them. For James Whitfield, who had built something careful and true, and had known in the last months of his life what it was worth and who could be trusted with it. And for Eliza Harper, who had traveled 2,000 miles to begin a life and had found in the difficult country between arriving and belonging something that she had not known she was looking for and could not have named before she found it ground. Solid ground, the kind that does not shift when the weather changes. The kind that was worth lighting a lamp for in the dark. The creek ran, the lamp burned, the mountains held their ancient, patient shapes against the turning stars. And morning came quietly the way mountain mornings always arrive, with nothing but the light itself coming steadily from the east until the darkness had nowhere left to be.